It is a great privilege for us at DACAMERA to be here at the Menil Collection. And this is the first in a new series that we're developing here called Hearing Color, Seeing Time, where we're pairing certain works of music with certain works of art. And nothing could be more inspiring than actually getting the opportunity to spend time with these paintings and to make music in these inspiring spaces. So today we're going to be looking at this wonderful painting by Helen Frankenthaler called Hybrid Vigor, and the piano piece by Maurice Ravel, Une barque sur l'océan. A Boat on the Ocean was composed in 1905. And this magnificent painting by Helen Frankenthaler was painted in 1973. So I didn't choose these pieces because they were contemporary, but I chose to play this work of music next to this painting because I felt they could really speak to each other across time, and that some of the concerns of Helen Frankenthaler and of Maurice Ravel in this piece actually relate to each other in an interesting way. I think abstract painting and music are two of the hardest things to talk about, and sometimes by putting two things together and looking at similar urgency even behind the artist's intention, you can start to see something that makes connections. A lot of this idea of connecting painting and music and other things, that there's a kind of core essence that might be the same among these different art forms, goes back to the ideas of the French poet and critic Charles Baudelaire, who wrote a beautiful poem called Correspondences. And in that poem, he says, the scents, the sounds, the colors speak to each other. And the idea of correspondences, it's hard to find an equivalent in English, but the idea that there's something in common among different works of art is one that I think can be really powerful, and it's one that has always informed my own work and going through life. And I think it's something Helen Frankenthaler thought about as well. And in terms of picking works from different time period, Baudelaire had another thing to say about this, which I've always loved, where he defines the modern. And he talks about how part of the modern is always fleeting and very much tied to the time in which it's created. So there's something ephemeral about it. But there's another aspect which is timeless and stays true through time. And those are the areas where I think you can find these connections. Now, this painting is it has so much vibrant color. It's called Hybrid Vigor, and so much motion in it. And there's a long history, actually, of abstract painting and music being closely tied. In the very beginning of the 20th century, the painter Vasily Kandinsky was moving from landscapes towards a more abstract art form. And it was hearing the music of Arnold Schoenberg that kind of brought him over the edge and brought him to making paintings where there were no longer forms that could be related back to nature. And it came out of landscapes. And there's a similar tradition, a similar source in the work of Helen Frankenthaler. Kandinsky was one of her influences, and that's something that I saw, but there are many influences in her work, some of them from 19th century painters, some of them back to the Renaissance. She embraced all of art history and had her favorites from many different periods, and often in her work even responded to them. But at the same time, there is also this connection to landscape, to nature. And that's something that permeates her work. Now, the piece that I played, the Ravel piece, is called A Boat on the Ocean. So in a way, I've paired an abstract painting with a work of music that you could say is not abstract. But in a sense, all of music is abstract. It's not representational. And it's more an impression, a response to this natural phenomenon of watching the sea. And the sea, which has so much motion and so much rhythm in it. Now, one of the things I found out about this piece by Ravel, which I hadn't realized when I embarked on this little project, was that he actually dedicated this piece to a painter, Paul Sord. This piece is one of a set of, that he called miroir, mirrors, and he had the idea he wanted to write experimental pieces that had an improvisatory quality to them, and he dedicated them to different friends of his. But this one in particular, he dedicated to a painter. And this piece really makes you feel, as a pianist, as though you are a painter. There's something about those cascades, there's something about the colors. It's interesting how different composers make you feel you're doing something different, even though you're playing the piano. I mean, when I play late Beethoven, I feel like I'm a philosopher. I mean, it's such deep philosophy. Yet this piece is very much like a painting to me, and I think it has to do with the fluidity, the sense of color, and the fact that it's very framed. In a sense, it doesn't go anywhere. It ends very much where it starts. Helen Frankenthaler, early on in her career, in the early 50s, she had an epiphany. She was still in her 20s, and she went to the studio of Jackson Pollock. She, very early on, got to know a lot of the very important artists who were about a generation older than her, and she was taken to Jackson Pollock's studio out on Long Island by the critic Clement Greenberg, with whom she was very close in her early 20s. And she saw Jackson Pollock's way of working, where the canvas was no longer on the easel, but the canvas was on the floor. And she felt that she wanted to do something like that, a style very, very different from Jackson Pollock, but to experiment with a completely different way of painting. And as a result, because of the way that she would pour the painting onto the canvas, you get this very fluid sense. So the connection to water, to me, seemed immediate. And you often have the sense in her paintings that the paintings are still in motion, and you've just caught them at a moment when the motion stops. So there's tremendous sense of both improvisation and control, responding to things that happen accidentally and turning it into a form of art, a painting with which Helen Frankenthaler would be satisfied. And we use words out of painting to talk about music all the time. We use color, for instance, and what does that mean? And in music, it can mean a couple of different things. Now, the way the Ravel starts is very much setting a color. One of the things that makes this piece actually abstract is the fact that there's no real melody. There's a little fragment that recurs, but there's not a tune that carries you through this piece to speak of. But this color that we get in the opening is made up of a chord and harmony in and of itself creates a sense of color. Also, there's the pedal, which is what really changes these individual notes to something which is, I think, where we hear the water. We hear not individual lines, but suddenly a color emerges from the way these notes come together. So this whole opening uses repetition to set a feeling of a space, that we're in one space, we're not going anywhere. It starts to feel like a kind of musical home. So we have those two notes emerge. But then we have this kind of rolling sense of rhythm, as though we are being rocked. And I think of this opening now very much like the blue at the center of this painting, because the painting, it's divided in a sense into thirds, and that middle area goes in two very different directions. It rises up to what is kind of, I would say, a climax of that painting, where the colors mix, and then it goes down into this more brilliant yellow. Now, the other reason one would think of landscape is, of course, just the sheer colors. And this painting gives so much pleasure just from, it gives pleasure just from the way these colors interact and the beauty of the colors. But blue and green always evoke nature to us, yellow, and then we have this explosion, in a sense, on top. This question of nature and abstract art and how they interact is a really fascinating one, I think, because of course it's possible to see nature in an abstract manner. And I think we tend to see landscapes as human beings. We identify things as landscapes. And if you just take a painting in a horizontal position and put a horizontal line like that, many human beings will read that as a horizon. We interpret it as a horizon, and especially if we see blue and green in it. But we tend to see a horizontal divided canvas as something that speaks to us in a very primal way that relates to landscape. The other thing that strikes me as being very similar to music and also this piece, Helen Frankenthaler spoke a lot about line out of color, that when color creates the line. And you can see that happening in this painting because of the way the colors are poured, right? The edges do form lines, but they're not drawn lines. Those lines are formed completely by the color. And when you listen to the Ravel, it's a very similar thing because the harmonies are what are giving you that sense of color. Now, here what happens, as this repeats, when that harmony shifts, it really is like a shift of color. We hear it that way, going from where we've been Now, Helen Frankenthaler talked about nature a lot in terms of her painting, and her kind of breakthrough painting was called Mountains and Sea. And this is a later painting. That painting was back from the early 1950s. But nature always stayed in her imagination. And when you think about it, it's a natural thing. An artist is constantly looking around them, and everything that they see is going to become an impression. And Helen Frankenthaler felt very strongly that everything that you experience then comes out in your art. And in her sense, she spent a lot of time both in Provincetown, at the sea, but in nature. And she said, when asked about it, I held the landscapes in my arms, which I think is a beautiful image. And the idea is that everything that she experiences, the memory of these landscapes stay within her, and then they come out in the act of painting. And I think it literally means in her arms, because when you see the photos of her painting with the canvas on the floor, she was absolutely physically in the painting. And you sense all of this movement is almost like a dance that's involved in creating the painting. So in this piece too, the lines are made from the color. The shapes rise and fall from the colors. There are very few places where there's an actual drawn line. And what do I mean by that in the piano? Well, an actual drawn line is when you just have single notes played. And we have it happen in a couple transitions. We're coming out of something here, which is just pure color, this rumbling, and then we have. So that to me is a line that's actually etched. So that's really the first big climax. This piece really has two large climaxes. And all of the colors start to move, right? We've been for a long time in just one color that stays for a long time, meaning one harmony. But here, how do you create a climax in music? Well, here what happens is these chords, the chords are changing. Okay, so that's just the chords alone. What else has happened? Well, we started out in this part of the piano. Okay, so register has a lot to do with creating drama and with creating a sense of landscape in music. This is kind of our home base, like the center of that painting. But as all those harmonies start to move at a faster pace, also the dynamics grow, and so we have more events happening per pulse, more drama, and all of the register of the piano is being used. So all of that builds. The same way this painting, I think, builds up. There's a kind of climax that happens when you have the colors mixing, the blue mixing with a red to create this purple. There's a kind of stormy build up there, which is very different from the more peaceful sense below. So that creates the drama up there, but it merges in. It doesn't have a break. Same thing in this piece by Ravel, where the texture basically stays consistent throughout the piece. It's a wash of color with shifting tides, shifting rhythms, and shifting colors. And then when we have these climaxes, they swell up and go down. I feel like you feel the paint pouring in a sense. I mean, not to be too literal about it, but it's a similar physical gesture, a kind of release and flow that happens in nature, and it happens in painting, even though painting is static, and it happens in music, even though in music too, we're using all kinds of words that don't necessarily relate just to sound, but are more metaphors for what we hear happening. And we hear that sound surge. It does something for us emotional that I think is similar to some of the pleasure that we get from a painting like this. Another interesting thing I find in this painting, I was mentioning before that there aren't too many lines in the Ravel. There's one that comes out here, and we get this theme, but it's a theme that's buried in the color more than we really hear it as a theme. There's only one time that theme gets a little bit more elaborate, where after the big explosion, we get to a soft moment. And then we get it's almost like we hear the theme finished for the first time. We get these lines that kind of underline the activity. Now, the lines on this painting, I think, are very different from the rest of the painting, right? They're extremely intentional to divide up the painting in that way. There's not an improvisatory sense about it. And the first line actually is the one all the way on top, which isn't so much painted as the absence of paint. Now, one of Helen Frankenthaler's really breakthrough techniques was this idea of not prepping her canvas. So at the same time that she started working directly on the floor, she stopped prepping her canvas as one normally would before applying oil paint, and then eventually she shifted to using acrylic paint. And so she left a lot of spaces on the canvas where you see the canvas coming through. And so there's a kind of transparency, even in the color, in the blue, for instance, which reminds us of water, for one thing, but it also creates a kind of almost fragility about the painting, the fact that it's almost floating on the canvas and yet coming very much out of the canvas. So there's a lot of space in it, and yet there's tremendous depth in the color. And I think the textures of this Ravel as well, it's transparent, but it's not pale. And there's something about that in this painting also. There was one other musical thing I wanted to mention, which is the idea of transposition, which also happens in painting. When you have a motif in one place and you move it to another place, or you do something similar but in a different color. And this opening, which we became so familiar with because it's repeated so much, at a certain point, it comes here. And it's amazing to me how the character shifts so much. I mean, it's the same idea transposed onto another chord, but because we're down in register, we've gone from here to here, and because the tonality is different, the pitches themselves have a kind of color to them, so that when we get to this one, we recognize it, but it's warmer, it's darker. The only way to describe it is to use painterly terms, I think, to make understandable what it is that we feel and what is going on musically. Helen Frankenthaler, she talked about this in a way that made me think about this piece. She talked about her process, and she said one of the things she loved about getting off the easel and going onto the floor was that no longer were the edges of the painting so much of a problem. Painters often talk about those edges where the painting ends and how to deal with them. And she said that once she was painting on the floor, it didn't bother her so much. And one of the advantages of doing this, so close up, you can see how the edges of her painting here, there's a very, very dark blue in those corners, but it's almost as though the painting could actually, continue. And at the same time, because of the canvas that you see bleeding through, there's almost a sense that the painting could vanish. It could disappear back into that canvas. And to me, the edges of the painting are a little bit like the beginnings and the endings of pieces. Although I think in music, often, I think somebody said something about how, if your ending is successful, that's all the audience is gonna remember. So a lot of composers there are a lot of pieces that end very brilliantly and excitingly. This piece just almost disappears the same way the painting could vanish into those empty spots on the canvas. And so we have these explosive moments, one of which I just, went through. And we have these there's a bit of a sense of menace at spots where you feel the danger of the sea, the danger of the storminess that we see up in the painting. This usually happens down below here. The sound down to the bass has a kind of menacing quality to it, but the whole thing at the end dies away and comes back. So we're getting these fragments of the very beginning. First, we get this returns. So we get less and less of it. And then it's just gone. So I hope you will get an opportunity to see this painting in person, because there's nothing like spending time with a painting. But this gives an opportunity. One of the things that you can only do virtually, in a way, is to get so close to a piece of music and a painting like this at the same time.